It is dawn over southern England, late autumn 1941. A pale mist rolls across the grass of RAF Benson, blurring the line between earth and sky. The roar of a Merlin engine shatters the silence. Not in thunder, but in a restrained hum, tuned for stealth. Ground crew step back, shielding their faces from the exhaust as a pilot settles into the cockpit of a most unusual machine. It's a supermarine Spitfire. Elegant, lethal, and legendary. But something is different. Its skin isn't the familiar green and brown of combat camouflage, nor the silver gleam of a reconnaissance craft. Instead, it's painted in a faint, dusty pink, almost absurd in a war of steel and smoke. The pilot glances at the horizon. The first light of dawn begins to spill across the clouds, tinting the sky in the same soft hue as his aircraft. He throttles up. Wheels lift. Within seconds, the Spitfire melts into the haze. Gone, as if it never existed. On the ground, only the scent of fuel remains. In the sky, an invisible eye is already on its way toward enemy territory. A secret born of desperation and of color had just taken flight. In the early years of the Second World War, Britain faced a dangerous problem. It was fighting an enemy it could barely see. The Royal Air Force, proud from its victory in the Battle of Britain, had mastered the art of defense. But victory in the air didn't mean vision on the ground. Across the Channel, German forces were fortifying, shifting, and building, unseen behind the veil of occupied Europe. By late 1940, the RAF's biggest weakness wasn't a lack of courage or aircraft. It was information. The Luftwaffe knew where to strike. The RAF didn't always know where to look. Every bomb dropped, every raid launched, depended on one fragile element: accurate reconnaissance. And that was where Britain's next great innovation quietly began. At first, reconnaissance flights were improvised. Pilots took standard fighters, Hurricanes, Blenheims, and early Spitfires, and flew deep into enemy territory, armed not with guns, but with cameras. It was suicide work. Heavy camouflage made aircraft visible at altitude. Gun mounts created drag. Every mission meant threading through German radar and flak, with nothing but speed and luck. It soon became clear. The RAF needed aircraft built not to fight, but to vanish. From this need, a new breed of pilot emerged: silent observers of war. In secret bases like RAF Benson and RAF Mount Farm, the foundations were laid for the future Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, PRU. Here, engineers stripped fighters bare. No guns, no armor, no radio chatter. Every ounce saved for fuel and film. Among the earliest pioneers were No. 16 and No. 541 squadrons. Their job wasn't to destroy, but to witness. They photographed enemy ports, supply lines, and even hidden rocket sites before they were finished. Their missions saved countless Allied lives, though few would ever know their names. As the war deepened, so did the science of survival. Reconnaissance demanded deception, not through firepower, but through invisibility. From green to sky blue, from silver to gray, the RAF experimented endlessly with color and contrast. Pilots learned that what worked in battle didn't always work in light. Clouds, haze, dawn, and dusk. Each required a different trick of the eye. By 1941, camouflage was no longer just paint. It was physics, atmosphere, and art combined. And it was here, in this strange pursuit to disappear, that one of the war's most peculiar innovations, the pink Spitfire, would soon emerge. To understand why the RAF turned to the color pink, one must understand the peculiar battlefield of the skies, where visibility meant life or death. At high altitudes, light behaves differently. In the upper air, the sun's rays scatter across layers of haze, moisture, and pollution. A Spitfire painted in dark camouflage might blend with the earth below, but against the pale English sky, it stood out like a shadow across glass. Likewise, silver or blue finishes, though elegant, often betrayed the aircraft when sunlight glinted off the wings. Photographic reconnaissance pilots, the PRU men, flew not at midday, but at dawn and dusk, when light softened and the air filled with a milky glow. These were the hours when the sky was neither blue nor gray, but washed in hues of rose and amber. It was the most dangerous, yet most effective, time to fly unseen. Through endless trial and observation, a handful of engineers and pilots began experimenting with subtle tones that reflected this twilight atmosphere. They tested everything: light blues, lavender grays, pale creams, but one color behaved unexpectedly well: a faded, chalky pink. It wasn't the bright pink of a parade aircraft, but a muted tone that seemed to dissolve into the morning haze. Under low sunlight, the aircraft almost disappeared. Against cloud or mist, its outline blurred until even trained observers struggled to track it. The man most often credited with advancing these experiments was Flight Lieutenant Sidney Cotton, an Australian-born pioneer with a passion for aerial photography and unorthodox ideas. Before the war, Cotton had already been testing camouflage paints and high-altitude cameras. His motto was simple: speed, stealth, and surprise. Under his direction, the RAF's Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, PRU, was born. At its peak, the PRU operated hundreds of modified Spitfires and Mosquitoes. Each aircraft carried no armament, no radio chatter, and only one objective: photograph enemy territory and make it home alive. To Cotton, paint was as much a weapon as the Merlin engine itself. He encouraged his crews to think like hunters, not of men, but of light. It was through this mindset that the unusual PRU pink emerged, a color that, under certain skies, rendered a Spitfire nearly invisible. What began as an experiment soon became quiet policy. By late 1941, select reconnaissance squadrons were flying missions over France and the Low Countries in these pale, ghost-like aircraft. Their camouflage wasn't aggressive. It was passive genius. The pink Spitfire wasn't just an aircraft. It was a lesson in perception, how understanding the world's light could mean mastering its shadows, and it was from this unlikely blend of science, art, and courage that a new chapter of warfare began, one best understood through its many angles. For most RAF pilots, survival meant firepower. For the men of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, survival meant not being seen. Their missions were flown alone. No escort, no backup, and no radio chatter. Once a pilot took off from bases like RAF Benson or Mount Farm, he vanished into silence, flying hundreds of miles over enemy lines with nothing but fuel, film, and faith. Theirs was not the roar of dogfights, but the hum of isolation. These pilots had to be calm, mathematical, and unnervingly brave. Every second mattered. Flying too high meant freezing cameras and thin oxygen. Too low, and they risked detection or flak. Many never returned. Others came back with engines full of holes, but their films intact. For them, courage was not pulling a trigger. It was keeping a steady hand as anti-aircraft bursts blossomed around them. Every mission demanded precision. The photographs they captured, rail yards, airfields, submarine pens, became the unseen foundation of Allied strategy. The Normandy landings, bomber raids, even V-weapon site discoveries all began with these silent witnesses of war. Their machines reflected their purpose. PRU Spitfires were unlike any other. Stripped of guns, armor, and even radios, they were the purest expression of flight, designed not for combat, but endurance. Engineers replaced bulletproof glass with lighter perspex, extended wingtips for higher altitude, and added extra fuel tanks where ammunition once sat. Some Spitfires carried up to 5 cameras, hidden in the fuselage, capable of taking crystal-clear images from 30,000 feet. Speed was their only defense. A reconnaissance Spitfire could outpace most German fighters, but if caught, there was no chance to fight back. Pilots often joked grimly that their weapon was the throttle. Yet, within this vulnerability lay strength. It forced perfection. Each sortie was a ballet of precision. Altitude, light, weather, and timing all had to align. If one variable failed, the pilot's life hung in the balance. And when the RAF introduced new colors for concealment, blues, grays, and eventually the strange PRU pink, it was these men who trusted their lives to the science of color. They became invisible ghosts of the sky, masters of light and patience, flying unarmed yet armed with one of the war's most powerful tools, information. Their story was one of human endurance bound to technological ingenuity, a partnership of flesh, steel, and silence. And as the skies over Europe grew deadlier, the next question became simple but urgent. How far could color and courage hide them from the enemy's eyes? The tactical brilliance behind the pink Spitfire lay not in technology alone, but in an understanding of nature itself. The sky, at dawn or dusk, was never one color. It was a shifting veil. Layers of mist, light, and shadow blending into tones the human eye struggled to define. Under these conditions, dark camouflage broke the illusion of distance, while reflective silver betrayed every angle of sunlight. Pink, strangely, did neither. When the first light struck the haze, the pale, matte surface of a pink-painted Spitfire scattered the rays evenly. To anyone looking upward, whether from the ground or another cockpit, the aircraft simply melted into the sky's low, warm glow. At dusk, when the air turned golden and the horizon flushed red, the effect was the same. The Spitfire became a ghost. German observers later admitted that some reconnaissance aircraft seemed to vanish against the clouds, spotted only when contrails gave them away. This camouflage wasn't permanent. It was timed. The pilots called these twilight runs, operations launched at the narrow windows of sunrise or sunset, when the pink paint gave them their best chance to survive. It was a tactical art form, 1 hour too late, and the color failed. 1 cloud too high, and it stood out. Meanwhile, German defenses were adapting. Radar could detect mass bomber formations, but single high-speed aircraft, especially those flying low in early morning haze, often slipped through unnoticed. Visual identification remained critical, yet Luftwaffe spotters were ill-equipped to track aircraft that blended with the very atmosphere. Flak gunners, relying on glimpses and sound, frequently misjudged altitude and distance. Fighter pilots, sent scrambling from bases in France and the Low Countries, sometimes reported chasing phantoms, aircraft they could not confirm visually. The pink Spitfire was not invincible, but it forced the enemy to question their own eyes. Yet beneath this tactical success lay a moral weight. These men flew unarmed. Their protection came from ingenuity, not firepower. To trust one's life to paint, to a theory, demanded a rare kind of courage. Many knew that if they were intercepted, survival was nearly impossible. There would be no dogfight, no surrender, only a plunge into cloud and hope for mercy below. Still, they flew, not for glory, but for knowledge, for the photographs that could shorten the war and save thousands on the ground. Their missions turned science into salvation. And soon, this fragile balance of color, courage, and chance would face its greatest test, in the heart of occupied Europe, where the pink Spitfire's camouflage would meet its ultimate proving ground. Autumn, 1942. Northern France. The weather was the kind that grounded most aircraft, a heavy haze hanging low over the countryside, cold mist blurring the edges of the world. But for the pilots of the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, this was the perfect sky. At RAF Benson, a single Spitfire prepared for takeoff just after first light. Its wings carried no bombs, its fuselage no guns. Instead, deep inside the frame were 5 F-24 aerial cameras, loaded with film fine enough to capture a single vehicle from miles above. The aircraft was painted in the faint, dusty shade, now whispered among crews as PRU Pink. The pilot, one of the few cleared for such experimental camouflage, knew his mission by heart: photograph German transport routes near Caen and Cherbourg. Intelligence believed the Wehrmacht was shifting men and armor toward the Atlantic coast, and proof was urgently needed. As he climbed through the morning mist, the light caught the horizon, soft and gold. Within minutes, the Spitfire vanished into the glow, not because of distance, but because it had become the sky. From below, even trained observers could see only cloud. Crossing the channel, the pilot throttled down to conserve fuel. His altimeter ticked steadily at 20,000 feet. Below, France stretched out in muted gray and green. Rail lines snaked through fog. Convoys crawled along roads that led to fortified ports. Every few minutes, the cameras clicked, the aircraft's belly doors snapping open and shut like the blink of an eye. German patrols were on alert. Reports of high-speed reconnaissance aircraft had spread across occupied France. Flak batteries scanned the horizon, searching for silhouettes against the morning glow. Yet none saw the ghost above them. Even Luftwaffe fighters, dispatched from bases near Lille, missed the intruder. Their eyes, trained for darker shapes and silver flashes, failed to notice the faint pink shimmer dissolving into the clouds. Over the target zone, the pilot dropped to 10,000 feet, slicing between layers of fog. The risk was enormous. Radar coverage, flak bursts, engine stress. But the photographs he captured that morning would later reveal vital German troop concentrations along the rail corridors, confirming Allied suspicions and altering bombing plans for weeks to come. He turned for home, engine coughing in the cold, the channel's horizon barely visible through the haze. Behind him, a trail of vapor faded into nothing, a vanishing thread in a gray sky. He returned with empty fuel tanks, frost on his canopy, and a camera full of answers. The pink Spitfire had done what no weapon could. It had outsmarted sight itself. When the Spitfire rolled to a stop back at RAF Benson, its engine ticking in the cool morning air, the ground crew ran forward, silent, knowing the pilot had crossed a sky filled with danger. The aircraft looked almost spectral under the pale sun, its pink paint dulled with frost and oil streaks. Inside the fuselage, the real victory waited. Film canisters, chilled but intact. Hours later, in the dark room, technicians dipped frames into developer baths under red light. Slowly, the images came to life. Black and white windows into occupied France. On the glossy paper, German columns could be seen stretching along narrow roads, convoys hidden under tree cover, locomotives clustered at rail yards near Caen. Each photograph bore perfect clarity, each angle precise. The intelligence analysts gathered in silence. These were not just pictures. They were maps of the enemy's movement. Thanks to them, Allied bombers could strike the right targets and avoid civilian areas. The reconnaissance data from that single mission reshaped operations for an entire sector. That day's success was not an isolated miracle. Across late 1942 and into 1943, pink-painted Spitfires of the PRU completed dozens of similar sorties. Their camouflage proved remarkably effective in certain weather conditions, especially when the air was filled with moisture, or during the brief twilight hours when blue and red wavelengths blended to create a rosy sky. German reports began to describe mysterious reconnaissance aircraft that appeared from nowhere. Pilots claimed to see fleeting shapes in the dawn haze, only to lose them seconds later. Luftwaffe radar could not lock onto such small, fast targets flying at high altitude. Even when a visual chase was attempted, the advantage of invisibility often carried the British pilot home. Of course, not all returned. Many pink Spitfires vanished for real, claimed by flak, mechanical failure, or simply weather. But even their loss reinforced the power of the tactic. Each successful sortie demonstrated that invisibility was achievable not through magic, but through science, courage, and trust in innovation. In war rooms, senior RAF officers reviewed mission results and began approving wider use of specialized camouflage. Pink was never standard, but it became an accepted tool, applied to aircraft flying at low altitude in twilight or cloudy skies. For the men who flew them, it was more than paint. It was armor made of color. By the end of 1943, PRU intelligence had become one of the Allies' most valuable weapons. What began as an experiment in light and pigment had transformed into a strategic advantage that reached from Normandy to Norway. The strange pink Spitfire, once dismissed as absurd, had proven itself in the only way that mattered: by saving lives, shortening missions, and seeing what no one else could. And as the war pressed onward, its quiet victories would ripple far beyond the skies of France, shaping the aftermath of reconnaissance itself. By late 1943, the results of Britain's daring reconnaissance experiment spoke for themselves. The Photographic Reconnaissance Unit had grown from a handful of improvised aircraft into one of the most vital intelligence arms of the Royal Air Force. Its pilots, flying Spitfires painted in pale blues, grays, and the rare, near-mythical pink, had photographed more than 500,000 square miles of occupied Europe. From submarine pens along the French coast to hidden rocket launch sites in Peenemünde, their cameras mapped the war before it unfolded. On paper, their success rates seemed almost impossible. Reconnaissance. Spitfires completed thousands of sorties, and despite the staggering odds, nearly 80% of missions returned with usable intelligence. In some months, especially during the build-up to D-Day, over 10,000 aerial photographs were analyzed weekly by teams of interpreters in England. Losses were inevitable and devastating. The PRU suffered some of the highest casualty rates in the RAF. Out of every 100 pilots who took to the air, nearly half would not return by war's end. Some disappeared into the sea, others into clouds of flak over Germany. Their missions left no contrails of glory, no public headlines, only the quiet gratitude of those whose operations they made possible. Yet, within the RAF, a transformation was underway. Before 1940, reconnaissance had been treated as a secondary task, an afterthought to combat. By 1943, it had become a strategic weapon. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Tedder himself remarked that photo reconnaissance has become the eyes of the Air Force. No bombing raid, no invasion, no strategic shift occurred without the confirmation of aerial photographs. The doctrine changed fundamentally. The RAF learned that knowledge could be more powerful than ammunition, and that invisibility, when mastered, could serve as armor. Units were reorganized into dedicated reconnaissance wings. Specialized aircraft like the Mosquito PR variants were introduced, following the Spitfire's model: speed, altitude, and stealth. And through all these changes, the principle of light-based camouflage, the lesson taught by the pink Spitfire, endured. What had begun as an experiment in paint and perception evolved into an official strategy: use the sky's own colors to protect the pilot's life. The war was still raging, but Britain's unseen airmen had already proven that victory sometimes came not from fire, but from the quiet art of disappearing. As the war drew toward its climax, the influence of the pink Spitfire stretched far beyond its brief operational life. The idea that color could serve as armor had rewritten the playbook of aerial warfare. By 1944, RAF engineers and scientists were conducting systematic studies on atmospheric light, reflection, and the psychological perception of color. What had once been dismissed as eccentric, the notion of painting a fighter pink, was now studied with the same seriousness as radar or engine design. The lessons learned from those experiments shaped the next generation of reconnaissance and stealth thinking. Aircraft designers began focusing not just on power and speed, but on visual evasion. The Mosquito PR variants adopted subtle sky-toned finishes, blending into the horizon at high altitude. Later, American reconnaissance planes like the Lockheed F-5 and the F-8, a reconnaissance version of the P-38 Lightning, drew inspiration from RAF color studies. Even in the jet age, aircraft developers continued exploring low-visibility coatings, a legacy that would eventually lead to the concept of stealth itself. For the pilots who had flown those pink Spitfires, the legacy was more personal. Most of them never saw their names in newspapers or heard public recognition. Their missions remained classified for decades, but among the Brotherhood of Flyers, the legend of the Pink Lady endured. They spoke of her in quiet tones, a strange, graceful ghost that had once protected them from death with nothing but color and courage. Some veterans later recalled how their aircraft drew laughter from ground crews before takeoff, only to earn reverent silence when they returned from impossible missions. "It looked ridiculous on the ground," one pilot reportedly said, "but in the air, it was like flying inside the sunrise." After the war, a handful of surviving reconnaissance Spitfires were restored to their original finishes. One, repainted in that faint dusty pink, became a museum piece. Not for its victories in combat, but for its triumph in survival. It stood as proof that ingenuity often wears an unexpected shade. The pink Spitfire had not changed the course of the war by itself, but it had changed how men thought about the sky, about visibility, vulnerability, and the line between life and discovery, and in that transformation, it left behind something far greater than camouflage, a reminder that even in war, imagination could save lives. The color faded with time, but its message endured, leading history gently toward reflection. In the long gray memory of war, the pink Spitfire stands out as a quiet miracle, a symbol of ingenuity born from desperation. It was not the product of grand strategy or powerful weaponry, but of observation, imagination, and the courage to try something different when survival depended on it. In a conflict defined by machinery and firepower, this delicate shade of paint proved that intellect could be as powerful as armor. The pink Spitfire was where science met instinct, where the physics of light and the psychology of fear intertwined in a single, graceful solution. It turned the sky itself into a shield, using nothing more than the dawn's own palette. For the pilots who flew them, those missions were not about glory, but about trust. Trust in their machines, their comrades, and the faint veil of color that separated them from death. Each flight was a gamble against the limits of human vision and human courage. And yet, through that gamble, they revealed something profound, that innovation in wartime isn't only forged in laboratories or factories, but also in moments of fragile inspiration. A brushstroke against the impossible. The pink Spitfire faded from the skies, but its lesson endures, that even in humanity's darkest hours, creativity can be a weapon of survival, and beauty itself can serve the cause of life.